The message wasn't even meant for me. Someone forwarded it by mistake, typed my name into the wrong contact, hit send, probably didn't even notice. And in the 3 seconds it took me to read it, 14 years of my life rearranged themselves into something I almost didn't recognize. What nobody knew, not even me, not yet, was that I'd been living inside a story someone else had been writing about me for a very long time. I'm going to tell you exactly what I found. And I'm going to tell you exactly what I did about it. But first, you need to understand who she was to me. Because without that, none of what comes next makes any sense. Her name was Dana. I'm not going to change it. I considered it. I decided not to. We met when I was 24. Both of us new to the same city. Both of us at a job we were slightly too qualified for and slightly too insecure to leave. She sat 2 desks over from me. And on my 3rd day, she slid a Post-it note across the partition that said, "There's better coffee 2 blocks left. I'll show you at noon if you want." That was it. That was how it started. 14 years is a long time to know someone. In 14 years, I watched her fall in and out of love 4 times. I helped her move apartments twice. I was in the room when she got a phone call that her father had died. And I stayed until 2 in the morning and then came back at 7 because she'd asked me not to leave her alone too long. I was a bridesmaid at her wedding. 3rd from the left. Green dress I still have in a bag in the back of a closet somewhere. I gave a toast that made her cry. She framed the photo of that moment and put it on a shelf in her hallway. I know because I saw it every time I walked through her door. My husband Marcus liked her. Most people did. She had this quality. I've tried to describe it to people since, and I never quite land on the right word. She had this quality of making you feel like you were the most interesting person she'd ever been in a room with. She listened in a way that felt complete. She remembered details. She'd ask about something you mentioned in passing 3 months ago, and you'd feel seen in a way you didn't know you needed. I thought that was love. I think now it was inventory. My marriage wasn't perfect. Nothing is. Marcus and I had gone through a hard year. This was about 4 years into our friendship with Dana, where we were fighting more than we weren't. And I was starting to quietly ask myself the questions you're not supposed to ask out loud. I told Dana things in that year that I had never told anyone. About the fights, about the silence after, about a specific night where I sat in my car in a parking garage for 45 minutes because I didn't want to go upstairs. She held those things carefully. That's what I believed. She'd say, "You're not wrong to feel that." She'd say, "You deserve to feel safe in your own home." She'd say, "I just want you to be happy, whatever that looks like." Marcus never knew how much I talked to her about us. He would have been uncomfortable with it. The first thing I found out, the thing that came before the screenshot, came from someone I didn't expect. Her name was Priya. She and I had been friendly for years through Dana. The three of us would occasionally overlap at dinners or events, but Priya and I were never close on our own. She texted me one afternoon asking if I wanted to grab coffee. Just us. I thought it was a little unusual, but I said yes. She was nervous when I sat down. She ordered something and didn't touch it. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to not tell Dana I asked." I said, "Okay." She said, "Did you and Dana have some kind of falling out? Like a serious one?" I said, "No." I said we'd had one or two small tensions over the years, like any friendship, but nothing major. Why? Priya looked at the table for a long moment. She said, "She told me your marriage has been in trouble for years and that you've been really difficult to be around. She said she stays close to you because she worries about you, that you have a lot of anxiety and you don't handle rejection well, and that people find it hard to tell you things because you react badly." I sat there. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, but the honest answer is that I didn't feel anything yet. I was too busy trying to locate my face. I was aware that I needed to look like a normal person receiving information, and I was not sure I remembered how to do that. I said, "How long has she been saying this?" Priya said, "A while. A few years. I've started to notice that every time she talks about you, it's always something a little worrying. And I started wondering if you even knew that's how she was presenting you to people." I did not know. I drove home, and I sat in the driveway, and I thought about the woman who had listened to me cry about my marriage, who had heard things about Marcus that I'd never said to anyone else, who had been holding that information in her hands for years. And I thought about all the people in our orbit who knew Dana before they knew me. I started to think differently after that conversation. I didn't say anything to Dana. I kept showing up. I kept texting back within the hour. I kept meeting her for lunch and asking about her life and listening with everything I had. But something in me had shifted into a different gear. Quieter. More watchful. I started paying attention to things I dismissed before. There was the time, this was maybe 3 months after the conversation with Priya, where Marcus mentioned offhandedly that Dana had texted him to check in. I asked what about. He said she'd heard I was stressed and wanted to make sure he was doing okay too. He said it like it was a kind thing. I said, "Yes. That's thoughtful." What I thought was, she has a separate channel to my husband. There was the birthday dinner for a mutual friend, where Dana arrived, scanned the room, clocked me, and came over immediately. But before she reached me, I caught her saying something to the host, and the host glanced at me in a particular way. The kind of glance you give someone after you've just been told something about them. I'd seen that glance on other faces, I realized. Over the years, I'd seen it and assumed I was being self-conscious. I was not being self-conscious. I started doing something I'd never done before. I started comparing what Dana said to me about other people to what I later learned to be true. And the pattern I found was this. Dana's version of events always positioned Dana as the most reasonable person in the room, and anyone she was in conflict with as unstable or difficult or operating from a place of damage. Every story she told had the same shape. I was in her stories. I'd been in them for a long time. I just hadn't been there to hear my own name. And then came the screenshot. It was a Tuesday. I was at my desk, mid-afternoon. My phone buzzed. A woman from an old job, someone I'd stayed loosely in touch with, liked but didn't know well, had forwarded me a message. Below it, she'd written, "I'm so sorry. I sent this to you by accident. I meant to send it to my sister. Please ignore." But I'd already read it. It was a screenshot of a conversation between Dana and this woman's sister, someone I'd never met. And in the screenshot, Dana was describing me. And then came the screenshot. It was a Tuesday. I was at my desk, mid-afternoon. My phone buzzed. A woman from an old job, someone I'd stayed loosely in touch with, liked but didn't know well, had forwarded me a message. Below it, she'd written, "I'm so sorry. I sent this to you by accident. I meant to send it to my sister. Please ignore." But I'd already read it. It was a screenshot of a conversation between Dana and this woman's sister, someone I'd never met. And in the screenshot, Dana was describing me. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I'll tell you what was in it. She told this woman, a stranger to me, that I had never really dealt with my mental health and that people close to me paid the price. She said my marriage worked because Marcus was patient in a way most men wouldn't be. She said I had always been jealous of her success and that she'd learned to manage that by keeping certain things from me. She described a conversation I'd had with her in confidence. The night in the parking garage, the 45 minutes I sat alone trying to decide if I was going home. And she described it as, she has episodes like that. It's been going on for years. I try to be there for her. Exhausting. That word. I told her that story as one of the most honest things I'd ever told anyone. I told it as a sign of trust. I'd handed it to her specifically because I believed she would keep it. She had kept it as a prop. She'd been carrying it around for years and taking it out at dinner parties I wasn't invited to. I set my phone face down on the desk. I didn't call anyone. I sat completely still for a very long time. And then, slowly, over the following days, I began to remember things differently. Conversations I'd written off, opportunities that had quietly stalled, relationships I thought had naturally drifted, people who had been warm and then, for no reason I could identify, became slightly cooler without explanation. I thought about the promotion I didn't get, about the colleague who had interviewed me, who was, I suddenly remembered, a contact Dana had introduced me to. I don't know what she said. I never will. But I know what I started to understand. She hadn't just been talking about me. She had been actively shaping how people saw me, keeping me, in the eyes of everyone around her, slightly smaller than I actually was, making herself the stable, generous, long-suffering friend of someone who struggled, building a version of me that made her look good by comparison. For 14 years. While I gave the toast at her wedding and held her hand when her father died and slid my number to her first in every emergency. I made a decision in the 3 days after the screenshot I was not going to react. I was not going to confront. I was not going to give her a moment, not a single moment, where she could cast herself as the victim of my instability. Because I understood now. That was the trap. Any reaction from me became evidence of what she'd been saying. My anger would prove her right. My silence, well-timed, would prove me free. So I said nothing. I texted her back within the same window I always did. I suggested the same coffee place we'd been going to for 6 years. I asked about her sister's renovation and remembered the detail she'd mentioned the week before. And she was warm. And she was generous. And she was everything she had always been to my face. I had started building a very quiet life on the other side of hers. The first thing I did was talk to people, not to expose her, not yet. I talked to people I trusted separately, outside of any circle she had access to. I told a version of the truth that didn't name her. I said I was going through something, and I needed to rebuild my sense of who my real people were. Most of them understood, without asking for more. A few of them, when I said it carefully enough, told me things in return. Fragments, overheard sentences, an expression they'd seen on someone's face once when my name came up in a room Dana was in. I collected them all, not as weapons, as clarity. The second thing I did was tell Marcus. That conversation was the hardest. Not because he didn't believe me. He did, almost immediately, and that hurt in its own particular way, because it meant he had noticed things too, and filed them in the same drawer I had. The hard part was sitting across from my husband and recounting all the intimate things I had handed to a woman who would use them as currency in conversations I was never meant to know about. Marcus was quiet for a long time after I told him. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I didn't want to do anything dramatic. I told him I wanted to disappear from her life so slowly that she wasn't sure if anything had even happened. I wanted her to feel the withdrawal and not be able to name it. I wanted to give her nothing to point at. He said, "Okay, then that's what we'll do." The third thing I did was stop. I stopped telling her things, not abruptly, gradually, the way a tide goes out. I stopped sharing the small daily details that I'd been handing over for years without thinking. I stopped complaining. I stopped processing my life out loud in her direction. I answered her questions warmly and said very little of substance. I became, in her presence, a pleasant surface. She didn't notice immediately. That was the part that moved something cold through me. She didn't notice for nearly 6 weeks. I had believed for 14 years that the intimacy between us was mutual, that she knew me as deeply as I knew her, that the dynamic was balanced. The 6 weeks told me a different story. She was so accustomed to receiving that she didn't register the absence of it. She talked, I listened. She processed her life, I reflected it back. The conversation had always moved in that direction. I had just never seen it from the outside before. I went to her birthday dinner. I brought wine, a good bottle, the kind she liked. I hugged her at the door, and she said I looked beautiful, and I said thank you, and meant nothing. I watched her work the room. I watched her do to other people what I now understood she had always done. The listening that was cataloging, the warmth that was strategic, the questions that were research. I ate dinner at her table, and I smiled at her husband, and I helped carry dishes to the kitchen, and I left at a reasonable hour and kissed her cheek at the door. Nobody in that room knew anything was different, including her. What I had set in motion by that point was already done. I had been methodical. I had been patient. And I had chosen very deliberately a kind of ending that left no wreckage. Not because she deserved that grace, but because I did. The friendship ended the way I intended it to. Not with a door slamming, but with a door that was already closed before she tried the handle. I faded. I became consistently slightly less available. I responded warmly, but a beat slower, then 2 beats. I was busy in ways that were entirely plausible. I cited work, cited tiredness, cited the kinds of ordinary life pressures that are impossible to argue with. She never once questioned it, which told me something about how much she had invested in paying attention to me. After about 4 months, the contact dropped to once every few weeks. After 6 months, it was a check-in text on birthdays. By the end of the year, it was nothing. And she had found a way to present that in her social world. I can only imagine how. That did not require her to account for anything. I heard from Priya some months later that Dana had mentioned to their group that I had pulled away, and she wasn't sure why. That she'd tried to reach out and I'd been distant. That she hoped I was okay. I want to tell you how I felt when Priya told me that. I thought I'd feel rage. I'd expected rage. The clean, hot kind. Instead, what I felt was something quieter and more final. Something close to pity. Because the way Dana had framed my exit as my distance, my withdrawal, my struggle, was so perfectly consistent with everything she had been saying about me for years. It was seamless. It fit her story exactly. She had needed me to be a certain kind of person. And even when I left, she found a way to use my leaving as more evidence of it. The version of me that existed in her stories, the anxious one, the struggling one, the woman who had episodes and whose husband was saintly for staying, that version of me continued to exist in certain rooms after I was gone. And I had to make my peace with that. What I had on my side was this: the people who actually knew me, the ones I'd talked to quietly in the months of rearranging, the ones who had offered me their own fragments, their own small confirmations, the ones who had chosen, when the picture became clear, to choose me. My world got smaller, and then it got better. Marcus and I went through something in the year that followed that I hadn't expected. A kind of closeness that came from having been honest with each other about something difficult. From having sat in the kitchen and decided together how to handle it. From having been, for once, completely on the same side of something without any outside interpretation. I hadn't realized, until it was gone, how much of a thread Dana had been in the fabric of my marriage. Always there, always available to receive whatever I didn't say to him directly. Always the third presence in our house, even when she wasn't in the room. When I stopped, when that channel closed, Marcus and I had to learn how to talk to each other differently. And we did. I think about the 14 years sometimes. Not with the rage I expected to feel. The rage came and went faster than I thought it would. What lingers is something more complicated. I think about the version of myself that existed before the screenshot. The woman who believed that to be truly known by someone was one of the safest things in the world. I'm more careful now. I give myself that acknowledgement without shame. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, I think about her side of it. What she needed to do what she did. How much maintenance it must have taken to hold all of it together. How exhausting it must be to love people as instruments rather than as people. I don't forgive it. I'm not required to. But I understand something about loneliness now that I didn't understand before. And that understanding belongs to me. Not to her, not to what she did to me. Just to me. And whatever comes next, I'm building it on something real. The last conversation I ever had with Dana was on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Neither of us knew it was the last one. We talked about something small, a restaurant that had closed in our neighborhood that we'd both liked. She said it was a shame. If my story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar, you're not alone. Subscribe to Vengeance Verity. I share a new story every week. Real pain, real silence, real justice. And if this one hit something deep inside you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who would understand. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let someone else know they're not alone either.